Good evening, everybody. I'm suddenly much smaller because the step is gone in the back days anyway. So today I would like to start by thanking Safeguarding Archaeological Assets of Turkey project, and specifically Dr. Schadla-Hall for making it possible for the Institute to bring Tim and to give all of us the opportunity to actually listen to Tim Schadla-Hall. He read geography and archaeology at Cambridge, and then, as he keeps telling us, he had 4 different careers. So I'm going to mention them very briefly. First, he taught A-level archaeology at Cranleigh School. Then he spent around 3 years as a field archaeologist in Winchester and Wessex. Subsequently, he moved on to museum work and worked in Hull museums as principal keeper of museums. He moved again to Leicestershire, or whatever, probably, Museums, Arts and Record Service. Now he is reader in public archaeology at the Institute of Archaeology at UCL, where he lectures on public archaeology, museum management, and several other aspects of archaeology. His interests are the Mesolithic and the early Mesolithic in Northwest Europe. But he also researches on the archaeology of standing buildings and their landscapes, on various aspects of heritage law and repatriation of archaeological material, as well as on the economics of archaeology. He's particularly interested in public participation in archaeology and also in governmental policy development for the past. And he has published on all these topics. And last but not least, he is also editor of the journal Public Archaeology, which is one of the peer-reviewed important public archaeology periodicals. Now today, Tim is going to talk about he who controls the present, controls the past, George Orwell and public archaeology. So through a series of case studies, Tim will examine the use of the past by both individual archaeologists and the wider society, and will in turn ask the question about how both the appeal of archaeology and its potential abuse. So, and that will do from me. Please, Tim, thank you for coming.
Good evening. Could I just say, first of all, I'm very grateful to be invited to the British Institute, which I think is a truly wonderful organisation, and I haven't been paid to say that. Truly, so thank you. What I'm going to talk about tonight is partly autobiographical. I started this off because I was coming to Ankara. I started thinking about this lecture. And originally I chose 3 archaeologists, sort of archaeologists, all of whom I am fairly confident would never have read 1984, from which this quote comes, the great Orwell book. And I was doing this for a particular reason, which is the way we use the past. And it's one of the areas that I am concerned with in public archaeology. It also has a lot to do with my passport, which I've recently exchanged for another European Union passport before the British bring in the new horrible ones. And I noticed, and you'll see why this is relevant, that in my old passport I'd taken 5 trips to Turkey, 4 of which were to Istanbul, and the 5th was to Antalya. But I've never been to Ankara. I'll come back to that. I'd also been 4 times to Thessaloniki. And every time I went to Thessaloniki, every time I go, I shall go again soon, I shall once again pay the Turkish embassy so I can get in to see Atatürk's birthplace. It's one of those things. So Atatürk will come in tonight in terms of public archaeology. So, very swiftly, because I need to give you this brief background, and I apologise for my lack of skill. I can't make the pictures move all the time. I apologise for that, but I just wanted to remind you about what archaeology is. And I raise the questions because it's really a series of techniques for explaining the past through logical deduction, maybe. It uses material remains, and it's not really history because it's open to interpretation. Now, one of my Japanese colleagues simplified public archaeology by saying there are two approaches. One is the outreach approach, and the other one is the multivocal approach. The outreach approach aims to communicate information to the public in the most effective way. And that normally means archaeologists talking down to people and telling them what to think. The multivocal approach, of course, is about looking at different interpretations of the past by different groups of people and giving people who might be quite lunatic the right to talk about the past. So then this is just relevant. So those are two basic approaches. Now, what I'm interested in is the way in which the process of archaeology, the results, are manipulated. This goes down to individual archaeologists and their particular political views, which we could discuss at length. I might later. So I think there are this is me, there are good and bad archaeologists, depending, maybe in any science, if archaeology is a science. I'm not sure about that. So for example, I've mentioned one of the great Japanese archaeologists, a man called Kondo, who was a member of he was known as a Red. He was a left-wing member of the Communist Party in Japan after the Second World War, and he was subsequently suppressed for his political views. In my book, he's a good archaeologist. And then to compare him with the German archaeologist, Jan Kuhn, who was determined to create the Aryan myth, to the exclusion of everything else, and couldn't wait to get into the German army, and I quote, "so I can go and shoot some Slavs." So good and bad archaeologists, what archaeologists think colours what happens. And there's also the element in archaeology, which I'll come back to, of racism, which I'm going to talk about later. And then, of course, there's politically inspired archaeology, which is part of what I'm going to talk about tonight. Now, archaeologists often say archaeology is not a political subject. I am saying it is. Whether archaeologists accept that or not doesn't matter. The product of the work of archaeologists is inevitably politically manipulated. And I hope to show that. But it's also interesting about how archaeology fits within the state. In the United Kingdom, we have one of the loosest relationships between the state and archaeology that I think exists in Europe. That includes the bureaucratic control of archaeology and the bureaucracy. And it's interesting that certainly in much of Western Europe, archaeologists, partly because of sources of funding, are closely allied to the state. The pictures will start in a minute. Now, the business of suppressing and using the past is something that is with us now. I show this picture to say I'm not going to talk about the religiously inspired destruction of archaeological monuments, excepting to say it happens. I always remind myself, when we talk about this, that England, I use England correctly, England actually takes off economically when all the monasteries are ruined by Henry VIII. It's an interesting point, that destruction of an element of religion actually historically allowed England to prosper from the 16th century. But we condemn all forms of destruction today. It's the same in Norway. So I'm just mentioning this because what I wanted to do was to talk, first of all, about Atatürk. Now, as I say, I've always wanted to come to Ankara because I am I don't know whether I'm an Atatürkist, but I'm certainly convinced that Atatürk, as a 20th century politician, was a quite remarkable figure. And also, he died before 1984 was written. So we're quite safe, okay? But this is you've seen these quotes, so I'm not going to waste your time with this. But the interesting thing is Atatürk did use the product of archaeology in many, many ways to actually reinforce a deep and actually very wide past. This is quite remarkable, but it was one of the things that he actually did. Now, you will all know more about Atatürk than I do, I'm sure. But the whole point about doing that was, for me, reinforced when I went to Antalya. I'm taking this slide as I use it straight from a lecture I give to my students about the importance of preserving and looking after the past. And it came as news to me that Atatürk had actually visited, in a very short life, all these archaeological sites and actually gone round and said, look, we really need to understand the past and see that it's deeper. Now, I accept there were political reasons for that, no doubt at all. But there are also reasons which actually allowed an understanding of a much wider past. So I'm not suggesting he was an archaeologist, by the way. I'm just making the point that this business of he who controls the present controls the past is exactly what he did. Because he controlled the present in Turkey, he could therefore change what people saw in the past. And I think archaeology benefited from that. So this is part of what I want to talk about. But I also thought, because it's interesting to me, that I would remind those of you who don't know about the use of archaeology in another way. Now again, I'm not trying to make a point about whether the Turkish government is correct or not. In fact, I'm in favour, personally, of the return of the Samsat stelae back to Turkey. What I found interesting is that I think when the government requested it, the Turkish government, the British Museum produced a wonderfully long screed which said, you can paragraph this as actually it belongs to us because we were really given it by the French who were occupying Syria, where it happened to be at the time, even though it comes from a site in Turkey, so you can't have it back, which is terrible, really. The reason I wanted to show you it is because it makes the point about not only the ideas that archaeologists have, the interpretations they offer are important, but it also goes to the business, which we'll come to at the end, of identity and where archaeology has a real role to play. So you can actually see it in room 51, of the British Museum, and you can go and claim it back if you want to. Personally, I think the sooner it comes back, it's not even very nice. Never mind. Right, okay, now, the first of the areas I was going to deal with tonight. Has anybody here been to Malta? Great. Okay. Well, that's because you're a Brit. Sorry, I apologise. I recommend Malta now rather than later. I spent time in Malta doing research on gardens. There aren't many. But the point I wanted to deal with tonight was the case of Malta in terms of how the past is manipulated and used. The point about Malta is it sits there in the middle of the Mediterranean, and really from 1798, I think, when we threw the French out. Oh, let me explain. Malta belongs to the Knights of St. John until the French invade under Napoleon. Napoleon comes in, takes over the island he's only there for a week. He changes the whole of Malta, he rewrites the whole of the government, and the Maltese are very pleased because they didn't like the Knights very much, because the Knights took everything from the Maltese people. The one mistake the French made was that, having gone into Malta, they then decided to take all the silver and gold and all the effigies out of the Roman Catholic churches and melt it down for new currency. The Roman Catholics, Malta is still 90% Roman Catholic, and as a result, the French wound up being sieged inside the fortifications by the Maltese, who were aided by the British. And the British eventually, without conquest, realised if they wanted to stay in the Mediterranean, they'd be best off in Malta. So from 1815 and earlier, the British occupy Malta. They never occupied, well, the Maltese argue about this. They don't occupy it, they don't fight their way in. They come in and they run the country with the Maltese. It's not always easy, but it works. So from 1815 onwards, Malta, there's 3 islands. Malta is the centre of the British Navy, which is in those days key to running the Mediterranean. Malta has a unique language, which I'll return to later. The problem with Malta is that in the 19th century, Italy, you know where Italy is busy rearming and becoming a major power. And large numbers of Italians live in Malta, or go to Malta. It's hardly surprising when you see how close Malta is to Italy. So the British really worry. The great thing is, in the 19th century, Malta's temples are discovered. Malta's temples are the finest Neolithic monuments, I think, in the world. Oh, apart from anything you've got in Turkey. Now, the man behind all this, I said I'd talk about some archaeologists. Here's my first real archaeologist. There's a man called, I love this, Sir Themistocles Zamit. Yeah. You'll note his dates. So he wasn't around when 1984 was published either. Okay, sorry about it. Zamit was a medical scientist, a doctor, an academic. He was the first rector of the University of Malta. He was an archaeologist, and he was a polymath. he was given a knighthood for eliminating malaria in Malta in 1905. Interestingly, and he's obviously signed up to the British, which is fine, he's Maltese. He's lionised by the British because he is a brilliant academic, and also he carries out the excavations on the temples of Malta. Not always very well. I say that because none of you are Maltese, so I can say it quite safely. But remember, he's basically excavating from about 1900 and uncovering these remarkable temples, which are apparently unique in the world. There's no parallels for them, apparently. I must be very careful as I'm being recorded, and some of my Maltese friends might find out what I'm saying tonight. Never mind. So, Zamit, for example, wrote the first history of Malta. Those are some of the early excavations. He restored, in inverted commas, some of the temples as well. He was a key figure in Malta right up to his death. He was also the first director of the National Museum. The trouble with the temples of Malta, which I'm not going to talk about because it would take forever, is that it also allows Malta to become the last surviving piece of Atlantis. People go to Malta especially because they still believe in it. Also, some of the things that were discovered, the so-called fat ladies, yeah. I mean, actually, they could be fat blokes. Yeah, I mean, seriously. But anyway, all this stuff, all these myths about mother goddesses also relate to a lot of the finds from Malta at the time. And of course, the British loved it, yeah, because, you know, they could talk about being in Malta, nice climate, they've got the Navy, and they've also got these wonderful things for which there are apparently no parallels in Italy. So that means we have a unique civilization. Now, that is promoted by the British and aided and abetted by Zamit, partly because he's part of the establishment and partly because the British don't want to have anything to do with Italy. These same monuments today, and these are some of them, they've got huge shelters, the conservation is very good. The temples today are still visited by most of the tourists who go to Malta, unless they go for gambling, which is one of the other, or for the Roman Catholic Church. And the results are quite spectacular. The most famous site in Malta, the excavation of which was supervised by Zamit, is the Hypogeum. The Hypogeum is all in the living rock. It was in fact a major necropolis. I'm afraid it wasn't that well excavated. In fact, it wasn't well excavated at all for the time. But it now is, I think, the smallest air-conditioned World Heritage Site in the world. And if ever you go to Malta, even if you have to take ages in advance, you will see the scale of this site, all underground. It is remarkable. Now all this was done by Zamit, and the British imperialists, if I can say that, loved it, because here they are, occupying an island, keeping the Italians away, and saying, it's got nothing to do with Italy at all. There's no Italian connection. And also, the British invent the idea that the language is important, yeah, is actually Phoenician, which is crazy. I was talking to a public school educated old man up in a club in London last year, The Power of Archaeology, And I said, oh, I'm going to Malta. And he said, wonderful language. It's Phoenician, you know. I'm going, no, I don't think so. I think you'll find it's Arabic. No, it's Phoenician. And this idea of the language as well, if you think about, look at Atatürk again, what is he doing? He's controlling language, he's changing language, yeah. It's the same thing again. I'll come to another one. So, this is the interesting thing about Zamit. I could talk about Zamit for weeks. The British started to recognise that, the Maltese language wasn't really worked on or put in a dictionary, I'll come back to this later, until relatively late in the 19th century. The Maltese very quickly took on English as well, and in fact today the Maltese recognise two languages, Maltese and English. Yeah. It is, I think, one of the most interesting minority languages in the world. There are only 500,000 speakers of Maltese, yeah, and it's totally incomprehensible to nearly everybody else. Very quickly, in the Second World War, on D-Day, the Maltese were used on most British radios to speak in Maltese because the Germans didn't understand it because so few people speak it. So the language was critical. Now the interesting thing is that Zamit, a great archaeologist, well, I think so, actually went along, which I find interesting, with the idea that it was Phoenician. In fact, he actually said, he actually wrote, it is in Arabic. Which is sort of true, because it is in fact a Semitic language. It's the only one that is written in standard English script as well, yeah, and it is remarkable. There is a sort of variant in Sicily, but again, that's because of an Arab influence. And all I'm trying to say is, Zamit, despite being a great man, never really told the full story about what he thought about the language, because he was in the service of the British Crown. And it's interesting that, so he wasn't altogether honest. Now the interesting thing is that the language has actually Arabic, Sicilian, Italian, French and English in it. And there is a lot of Italian, but it was used, and the British encouraged the language as an identifier from the 1920s onwards in order to use that language to keep the Italians out. In fact, it's also worth noting that the famous Italian archaeologist who has recently been researched by Professor Vella, I'm beginning to sound like an academic, aren't I? Anyway, Professor Vella from the University of Malta has recently been writing about Ugolini. Ugolini was the man who started Butrint, the famous site in Albania, and he was also responsible for archaeological expeditions across much of Europe under Mussolini. And there's no doubt at all that Ugolini was an Italian spy working for the fascist government. That doesn't undermine his very interesting interpretation of European prehistory, because it was there. But the point I want to make is, here is an archaeologist who is living in the present at the time, using the past to establish a national identity for the Maltese, to the uniqueness of the archaeology and the language, even if, I suspect, we'll find traces of the temples in, I just realised I missed a slide. We'll find traces of the temples in Sicily, because that's almost certainly where the people came from. But it's another story. So, originally, I was going to talk about archaeology and Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong is the first leader of the People's Republic of China. You know, the man who sets up the current China is the father of the Chinese nation. And I missed the slide out because I was so confused. So let me just say something briefly about Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong lived considerably longer than everybody I've mentioned. He died in 1970 something. It was on the slide, sorry. It was Mao Zedong who said, which is amazing, make the past serve the present. So he promoted from 1951 onwards archaeology in China on a huge scale in order to establish Chinese greatness. So from the foundation of the People's Republic of China, archaeology has been a key national identifier to show the greatness of the Chinese people, and archaeologists have benefited from it for the whole of their careers in China, which is, I think, significant. Now, I started off by saying I'm a public archaeologist. That's what I believe in. 20 years ago, I'm sorry I missed the slides. 20 years ago, I was in Peking. I think it was my second visit to China with a delegation from the Institute of Archaeology. And my then director, I was the junior, said, you are giving the first lecture. So I stood up in front of a Chinese audience, scared stiff. All the senior academics were there. And I talked about public archaeology. And I said, of course, we have to remember that all archaeology is political. At the end of the lecture, that he's now dead, the senior professor, very distinguished international academic, stood up in the question session and said, I was translated, Schadla-Hall is wrong. There are no politics in Chinese archaeology. And because I'm not very clever, I immediately replied, is that why you call the People's Republic Army the Iron Great Wall of China, which is used in the past? After the lecture, my director suggested I left Peking as soon as possible, which I did. Anyway, never mind. So, the next one I want to deal with, because again it's current and it's very archaeological, is a brief introduction. I'm sorry about, I had to avoid talking about Turkey, you see. It's to talk about the Ainu of Hokkaido. Now, the Ainu live on the island of Hokkaido, which is the northern bit of Japan, the big island to the north. It's the least populated island, unlike Honshu. It's relatively empty. The Ainu, often referred to by the British in the 19th century as the hairy Ainu, right? Were basically hunter-gatherers who also exploited the landscape. Tremendous separate religion. And it wasn't really, well, it started in 1860 because of fear of the Russians, that the Japanese began to, I think I used the word, take over. They'd always controlled it, but they then began to settle the island for the first time. Effectively, because the Ainu had no written language, they weren't farmers, and they appeared to be relatively uncivilized. The Japanese eliminated Ainu culture in something like 40 years, because nobody would have a job unless they spoke Japanese. So you've got a huge indigenous population which is basically eliminated from memory within 2 generations, by the Japanese. They didn't kill people, It wasn't that sort of colonization. But they removed the language, and they removed the culture, and replaced it with Japanese culture, which under the Meiji Restoration is highly sophisticated. Yeah? And the point at the bottom, because it goes back to archaeology, is before the Japanese, this is what was taught, before the Japanese, there was no one, because the Japanese were, in the schools, taught that they were all descended from the gods, and they were technically civilized, and farmers. I make that very simple, but basically it's true. So, before the Second World War, very few people looked at Japanese archaeology before the Japanese Empire, yeah, before the late medieval period. They didn't accept that the prehistoric groups in Japan, the Jomon cultures, really existed. They weren't Japanese. We now know they are. So, oh sorry, it's a very bad map. Hokkaido's that bit, okay, right at the top. You can see it's not sparsely populated. But the interesting thing for me is that after the Second World War, the attitude changed completely towards the Ainu. And in fact, the Japanese have reconstructed Ainu buildings, Ainu interiors, and they now celebrate the Ainu and recognize them. This is a huge difference. Now, very quickly, if you look at Japan, these are the archaeologists. How did Japanese archaeologists and anthropologists regard the Ainu? Basically, they were Stone Age people, they were dwarves, and they had lots of legends, yeah? And Stone Age people were all really the Ainu, yeah? That was how they saw it, because they weren't Japanese. And the studies, I'm just giving you some examples, which I got from my Japanese colleagues, is the aim of studies is they have special values as a living catalogue of primitive society. Yeah? Aborigines in Japanese territory. The Japanese were actually much kinder to the Ainu than the British were to the Aboriginals in Australia. That's why I didn't do that one. And it wasn't until after the war that suddenly you have a resolution in Japan, recognising the Ainu as an indigenous people of Japan and changing everything, and actually the whole of the parliament agreed to recognise them. This is a huge change as a result of changes, as a result of the defeat of the Japanese in the Second World War. It's completely driven by archaeologists and anthropologists, and it's changed the whole view of Japan. So the national policy was changed through the rule of law. I'm not going to talk about this because I'm going to run out of time yet. And they actually allowed the government, was actually sued by traditional Ainu people in the 1980s. They took the case to court, and the Japanese government was found guilty. They have a very sound legal system in Japan. Yeah. It's based on the British. Sorry. So we've got these large numbers of museums and centres funded by that, and a promotion which 50 years ago would not have happened of a whole culture, which otherwise would be completely forgotten. And it's interesting, powered by archaeologists. I put this in because you use this on the poster. This is one of the reconstruction centres all over Hokkaido. You can go and play traditional biodegradable games in the museums, and the whole of the culture is now promoted in a way that a generation ago it would never have been mentioned. And this is the change to the present of looking at the past. These things happen all the time, which is why we should be careful. From non-existence to a celebrated culture and to recognise indigenous people. The Japanese have now invented, have completed a whole centre for Ainu and indigenous studies as well. And it's just this change in attitude by the archaeologists over a short period of time, which has changed a lot of other things. Just very quickly, this is interesting because it also raises the whole point about where we fit in repatriation. In the late 19th century, the Europeans particularly went out collecting Ainu burials because they were so backward and you wanted to study skulls. This is a list of some of the material which is spread all over the world from that period, which now the Japanese are reclaiming for the Ainu people. The whole process of archaeology, again, in politics. Very quickly, 2 minutes, very quickly, making this point that I hope I have. Colonial attitudes and racial attitudes are incredibly important in terms of the way archaeological interpretation takes place. 2 examples only. The first is the Great Zimbabwe, which is in what was formerly Southern Rhodesia, a British colony, now of course rechristened Zimbabwe. These ruins, which were actually, Sir Mortimer Wheeler went to them in the 1960s and made a film of these great ruins. And it became, the white settlers said, these are so sophisticated, they could not have been built by the blacks. Yeah. They must have been built by Arab traders. When people like Peter Garlake was the keeper of archaeology at the National Museum in Southern Rhodesia, and he pointed out that they were in fact built by the indigenous people. It's all in the record. In the 1960s, he was taken to one side by a trustee for the National Museum and told, you will lose your job if you say that. This use, again, of the past is something we should never avoid. And just my final example, because this is wonderful, the suppression of material is even more remarkable. This is South Africa, just after the abolition of apartheid, the appearance of Nelson Mandela. And this is the famous, I can do this, Makungubwe rhino. I've seen it. There it is in someone's hands. Yeah. It's not a sophisticated piece of gold work, but it's in gold. Now, it dates to probably about the 7th century, 12th century, and it's entirely African. It was excavated in the 1930s, but nobody talked about it. And they didn't talk about it because it's a bit sophisticated for black people to have made it. Yeah. And it wasn't until later on, in fact, it starts in the 1990s, that people talk about this great discovery for the first time as the politics change. Yeah. And now it is celebrated as a piece of African art, whereas in the past we just didn't talk about it because it implies something about the past. It's the manipulation of the past, both by politicians and archaeologists. So my message tonight was to talk about these elements of society and the role the archaeologist plays. I'm sorry I've been all over Europe and the world just to avoid Turkey, but the lessons are the same wherever you go. Here is one of the great unsung 20th century archaeologists, and again he is a man who could not have read 1984. Yeah. Remarkable academic, Unfortunately, most material that was published about him is in Finnish, which nobody reads. There's nobody here from Finland, is there? No, all right. Okay. Tolgren became the first professor of archaeology at the Finnish Helsinki University. But he also produced a journal, a remarkable journal, Eurasia Septentrionalis Antica. This was a journal that concentrated on prehistory between Germany, Finland, and Russia before the Second World War. He wrote the defining paper for me in 1936. Yeah. That paper was called The Method of Prehistoric Archaeology. Yeah. It was subsequently published in English because he was multilingual. It was published in Antiquity, which is the British journal, in English in 1937, on the twilight of the Second World War. In this article, which is beautifully written, he's arguing about what we can say about the past. And this is just a sentence he wrote. You can read it anyway. The point of departure about interpretation is partly political. That is so in Russia and Germany, both of them countries in which archaeology is used as an important political weapon in the service of ideology in home and foreign policy. When he published this article in 1936, I've seen the letters. Well, I've seen some of the letters. The German archaeologist von Richthofen, who was a colleague in Germany, wrote and said, if you don't withdraw this article, we will no longer publish in your journal, because we cannot have you saying our archaeology is political. Likewise, it's the same. Likewise, the Russians ceased all operation with this journal and the Finns because they refused to accept that their archaeology was entirely based on a political system. So what I'm trying to do tonight, probably very badly, is to talk about this wider role that archaeology plays and the role that archaeologists play within it with their own views. So when we look at the product of archaeology, it's worth remembering all of us come from a particular standpoint. And why is archaeology so popular? Or why are the results of archaeology so popular and so manipulated? I offer you some of the reasons. As Neal Ascherson said, quite rightly some years ago, maybe nationalism is the handmaiden of archaeology in terms of the way we practice it today, even though we would claim we are neutral, because we're not. But it's also about the interest in lineage. Forget the self-interest. It's the need to be different. It's about belief systems. It's about security. We know who we are. Yeah. It's about economics. And it's about guilt. In my case, I'm just interested in trying to understand the complexities. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. I think that this lecture is a lecture that gives lots of ideas and elements for further contemplation. So maybe some people would like to understand some more elements of what Tim has just been telling us. So I would invite the publicum to start asking questions, please.
I hope you've got some.
Oh, we've got some.
We can go for a drink instead. Sorry.
Yes, Alan, please.
Hi, Alan Greaves, University of Liverpool. So I work in Western Anatolia on classical sites of Ionia, and a lot of the research teams who historically work there are from Germany. And I've written about the fact that there is a conscious decision, and I think it's a moral and principled decision not to engage with archaeological theory. But then, because engaging in archaeological theory, there is a risk that people are willfully misrepresenting of the past against that which is just commonly understood. But then if you dig below this kind of idea that there's no such thing as politics and that there's no need for theory, then there is an underlying kind of theory, an underlying kind of worldview at work. What would you say about that? I mean, how can I politely counter this kind of common view amongst colleagues in that community that I work amongst, that
there's no view to come, yeah.
Is it that archaeological theory, when you open that can of worms, when you see the past as being something that we interpret rather than something that simply is,
yeah,
that it can then be hijacked and taken in all kinds of directions?
Well, it will be. I mean, because my answer is, you've got to persuade people to accept those realities. I don't know how you do it. I mean,
if not by you, then by somebody else,
yeah.
It will be hijacked.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so better by
Because
us
it will,
than by somebody
I think
else.
the point about arguing or discussing it
Yeah.
is that it actually brings out the reasons why people may be doing things or not doing them. Because there'll always be a reason behind it, and you can't. It's like my colleague Ulrika Sommer was involved in a debate about in archaeological dialogues, where she was saying, as I would, in fact she said, I bet you wish you'd written this. She was actually having an argument with a US archaeologist. It's a very good debate. Who said, there is no politics in archaeology. Yeah. No, the whole of archaeology, like it or not, is political. You can't walk away from it. Even today, I mean, it's interesting that my country, there are still these crazy stories from the 19th century about archaeology, which are carried on today as myths that people believe. And if you're promoting what happens, I mean, it's going to be like that. I mean, it's like when you look at if you go to Sicily, wonderful Greek and Roman remains, and everybody talks about the Greeks and the Romans coming in. You're going, wait a minute, what about the people who are already there, who are just adopting? And so I don't see you can just eliminate the environment in which you live. I think it's better to understand it and accept the change. I'm sorry if that doesn't answer your question, but it's down to you.
It wasn't a question so much.
Yeah, comment.
There's a kind of, what should my strategy be to kind of politely rebut this position that there is no politics and there's no place for archaeological theory in archaeology, and particularly classical archaeology, I think is particularly fraught because you've got a supposedly objective set of facts about what happened in the past, because you've got texts, you have your Herodotus or whoever, and we can't possibly question that. And if we start to question that, then we question the very foundations on which the world has been built.
But the whole point surely is that using the techniques of archaeology, we can question virtually anything that a historian writes. Very quickly, I'm involved in the excavation work at the Battle of Waterloo, which is one of the most famous 19th century battlefield sites. And they're already rewriting the official history of the battle, because the British lied. Sorry, it was not true. I mean, and then you can do that through looking at the archaeological materials, so it can't be right. Yeah. I don't trust historians. They use too many footnotes. Sorry.
I am a little bit worried because I'm thinking like all these field works that we are doing, are we manipulating people in a way? Because we are trying to make archaeology more, you know, appealing to communities. And,
Yes.
and well...
No, you're not. I don't think you are. One of the things you're doing, which fascinates me, is you've carried out a survey, which I've said this before, is quite unique. It's the first balanced survey of attitudes to archaeology in one country, anywhere in the world, I think. I'm prepared to be attacked for that, but I think I'm right. What it seems to me you're doing, and I've looked at the Sarap material, that obviously I like, what you're doing is you're trying to find out what people's attitudes are to archaeology, rather than telling them what they should be. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a difference which will come out as you work. This is the difference between the way archaeologists operate and don't deal with local people. Many years ago, I went to a site in Morocco, very famous Roman site. I can't remember what it's called, but it's very famous. And it has just been declared, you may know, what is it? It's a World Heritage Site. No, Petra's in Jordan. This is in Morocco. And the Moroccan government, when it was declared a World Heritage Site, the first thing the archaeologists did was do a great big fence around this Roman city, so the people who've been driving their animals through and over it for centuries was stopped. Yeah, as the archaeologist deciding what should happen, rather than discussing with local people what they care about and how they identify. The process afterwards, where you may well say this is Roman or whatever, is a separate process to finding out what they value within their environment. Sorry, that's my view. So I don't think you need to worry. But I'll come and monitor some of the films.
Thank you very much, Bulvarı from Middle East Technical University. Your examples were all dating to the end of 19th and then first half of 20th century, which is a very critical period for nation building and nationalism rising and the world wars. And then there's an impression almost now that, oh, we are all over it and everything's okay, we're not looking at it from a nationalistic perspective. So where are we standing today? Do you have any examples, like contemporary examples that you could share with us maybe?
Well, yes, if I may be very specific, the reason I chose those examples, by the way, is because I didn't want to talk about today for all sorts of reasons. I can, and also because of the way in which they happen, because you can only look back to see it. I mean, a classic example, seriously, would be Scotland. Yeah, that bit at the top of my country. Yeah? I tried to exchange Scotland for the Malvinas with the Argentine Minister of Culture once, because I wanted to get rid of Scotland. No, sorry, I'm joking. The Scots believe they're Scots. They're invented, and they're now using their past to claim they're a different, unassociated people, even today, and in their museums. Yeah, so it isn't something that suddenly stops. It may be less violent, yeah, it may be less pronounced, but it is a constant process. So the Scots would like to hark back, yeah, did they say we're Scottish, when we all know that the kilt was invented by George III. sorry, it's like bagpipes. These things are happening now, and because they become myths, people believe them. This is not true. So I can do Scotland quite well without getting into trouble. But if you want to look at Ireland, it's the same. We have a complete Celtic mythology, which isn't true. You know, I mean, it's, and we teach, and what we say has a real effect. And one of the points that I made a rude comment about historians. I didn't mean it, but if you think about it, if you teach history, there is very little room for interpretation. It's, you know, George I, George II, George III taught. There's no room to change it. If you look at prehistory, you teach people to interpret alternatives. Yeah. So I suspect elsewhere in the world, I know, we're changing our ideas of interpretation all the time, and people are using it for different purposes. It's just that the 19th into the 20th century, for me, is easiest to look back at. That's all. I mean, I don't think it's any different. I don't think we'll see anything different in the future. You know, I mean, I always think of Saddam Hussein, completely destroying large parts of the archaeology with new bricks in order to promote the Syrian background to Iraq, even though there's no connection. That's only 20 years ago. It is 20 years ago, yeah. So I still think it's happening, and it will happen again, because of the appeal, especially of the deeper past, in particular areas. It's, I was going to say something, I think it might be happening in some areas of Croatia today as well. Sorry, so I don't think it's gone at all. I think it'll be something we have to live with. But I don't know.
First of all, thank you, sir. I wrote my question. What's your opinions and suggestion, of course, on the current archaeological investigation and workings in Turkey? On your slides, as far as I saw, you mentioned secularist opinion of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk in this particular area. With this regard, while we are talking about public archaeology, can we say that this area of Turkey is changed a lot by the means of current stance and political opinions?
Sorry, I was a bit slow. You're asking,
Can we say this particular area of Turkey, by the means of public archaeology, is changed a lot with the regards of political stance and opinions?
Now, is that the current day or the time of...
Current.
Which area of Turkey?
Yeah, it
Which
is.
area of Turkey?
Public archaeology.
Public archaeology, I understand. The understanding and how it's dealt with. I think I'm quite safe in saying that I think it's interesting that the current government of Turkey, certainly over the last 20 years, has taken a very interesting stance on the return of material. And I'm all in favour of that. I should declare to you all now, I want the Parthenon marbles to be returned to Greece. So my views are quite clear. I also, for all sorts of reasons. And that's confusing. In the case of Turkey, it seems to me, and again, this argues for the power of archaeology, even if we don't see it. It seems to me that there are elements of foreign policy which, just like the Greeks, the Greek government's done it again and again, there's elements of foreign policy which are exercising or using archaeology for political ends, which is nothing new. Yeah, I mean, that's all I can say. It's worth looking at in terms of the way that governments react. If you look at the French, anybody French here? Don't like the French. I'm not. if you look at the way that the French got the order for building railways in Japan, they did it by returning Japanese material to Japan on the quiet. Okay? If you look at the way that, again, I think it's interesting. If you're asking if it happens today, think about Monsieur Macron, the French president. He is busy offering to return material to various African countries who looted it. He's not really doing that, in my opinion, because he wants to give it back. He wants to do it for purely political ends, to increase French influence. So I think all countries do this, apart from the British apparently, for all sorts of reasons, yeah. But because it is, the archaeological product is a matter of international politics. It's a fact, you know, there's no doubt about it. So what happens in Turkey, I suspect, is no different to what happens elsewhere. It's just that we've got better at stopping the looting.
10 years ago, when I visited the British Museum, the artifacts taken from the Santos, which is Likya region in southwest Turkey, were labeled as Southeast Greece.
You should have. You should have complained. I'm sorry.
I complained, but I'm not sure.
I'll have to go back and have a look. But of course, I mean seriously, the British Museum is an illustration of imperialism, yeah? And money. That's all it is, you know. Actually thinking about these things is important. I still think it's amazing that we have arguments about. I choose the Parthenon marbles because it's easy. Anybody Greek here? Sorry. No, it happens all the time. But it is this use of the past. You've got to come to London to see the marbles. The building's still standing.
Yeah.
It's just that our prehistory doesn't look as good as Greece's. Sorry.
Okay, on that note, I think we could continue discussions by a glass of wine. Thank you very much, Tim, for this lovely lecture. And thank you for the audience for the participation.
Thank you. Yeah.